Okay, Tim, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, so Nathan, should I just start?
Yeah, let's start.
Okay, so I'm Tim Ganan, and welcome to this International Macro History online seminar series. We're very pleased to have a very interesting paper on the rise of fiscal capacity. The presenter is Davide Cantoni, and I'm the moderator. What we're going to do is Davide is going to speak without interruption until 11:40. Technically, you can ask clarifying questions, and I will then pose them to him. I'm very skeptical of clarifying questions since the paper has been distributed in advance. So in principle, he'll speak without interruption. Then at 11:40 my time, which is 40 minutes from now, wherever you are, we'll have Q&A. And let's take it away, Davide. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here. So let me start sharing the slides. So that should work now. Okay, yeah, it's wonderful to be here in this virtual audience. This is a paper on the rise of fiscal capacity, and I want to emphasize again the wonderful team of co-authors. So one is Catherine Moore from Bonn, and the other one is Matthias Weigand, who's a PhD student at Harvard. One way to think about the bigger question that we're asking is to look at a map of Europe in the Middle Ages or early modern period, and you're going to be dazzled by the bewildering number of territories and the complex ways in which people today have tried to map modern concepts of sovereignty and maps and borders onto a very complex arrangement of ownership, of territorial sovereignty, of complex relationships between people and feudal systems and so on. So here's an example of Hessen, this area in central Germany marked in the box there. This is Hessen in the 14th, 15th century. And as you can see, lots of little territories, enclaves, exclave, complex arrangements, as you can see with, different shadings that overlay each other. And as we know, 300 years later, Hessen is a Grand Duchy, is unified. And then 70 years later, it gets absorbed by Prussia, and then all of Prussia merges into the German Empire. So we have a radical, reorganization, simplification of these complex arrangements. And if you want, this is one of the most remarkable achievements in terms of the kind of organization of Europe, political and economic organization of Europe in the last half millennium. And so what happened is that these problems of overlapping jurisdictions, this ill-defined extent of the monopoly of power that I just tried to describe and sketch by showing you this map are mostly solved in most parts of Western Europe at least. And at the same time, we observe other things. We observe that the fiscal capacity and state capacity, the ability of the state of imposing taxes, of imposing the monopoly of violence, are strengthened. We move from a world in which we have informal arrangements, in which we have arrangements based on your kinship, based on some feudal understanding of order, give way to a modern bureaucracy, to institutionalized rule, to the rule of law. And we also move from a way in which states are defined by personal relationships, like feudal relationships, to a world in which states are defined by our modern understanding, the one that we try to map so hard into a pre-modern world, namely the idea that there is a border. And we can color the world into mutually exclusive and common exhaustive area with different colors, and then we understand who rules over what. So this is what happened in Europe over the last 500 years. And what we want to do in this paper is sort of understand part of this development in part of Europe. Then we will look at the Holy Roman Empire up to 1789, up to the end of the Old Order, if you want. And what we want to try to understand is the role of one factor, namely the ability of states of introducing a modern fiscal bureaucracy in this whole process. So what's the role of fiscal capacity in this major consolidation that Europe experienced in these 500 years? And in particular, we'll look at, we will have to bring together two things. One thing is our measure of fiscal capacity, our treatment, if you want. And what we will do is we will present you new evidence that we collected about which territories in the Holy Roman Empire introduce a modern fiscal bureaucracy, which is epitomized by this institution that is called the Chamber, or the Kammer in German, that centralized, and I will explain later on what we mean by centralized, but that kind of brings together a modern form of running state public finances. And so we will find evidence that territories in the Holy Roman Empire, 39 of them introduced such an institution by 1789. And then we will match it to another data set, a very fine-grained, highly detailed data set that starts at the level of cities and then aggregates all of the information at the level of territories of the Holy Roman Empire. So we will start with 810,000 observations at the city year level, and we will know a lot about the cities, where they are, what kind of economic activity they have, what kind of buildings they build, and so on. And most importantly, we will know in every year which city belongs to which territorial unit of the empire. So we will be able to construct bottom-up maps of the empire in every year, knowing all the different layers of sovereignty, also knowing if a city has different rulers, for example, is pawned away for a couple of years and then is bought back by another ruler. And all of these kind of transitions of cities to different territories, we'll be able to map them by building this bottom-up picture of all the dynamics in the Holy Roman Empire in those 500 years. And so all of this information will map into 2,390 cities that in turn will map into 625 distinct territories. And these territories, we will also map them to dynasties. So we will observe almost 2,800 rulers and 15,000 rule transitions. So a city moving from one ruler to the next, either because there is a dynastic succession or because, for example, the city is conquered by another ruler. And so what we will do, and this will be my brief roadmap for today's talk, is we will proceed in 3 steps. So the first step would be what you could think of as a first stage, if you want. So what we will do is we will discuss the circumstances of the of the adoption of this early fiscal institution. So what predicts which territories adopt this modern fiscal bureaucracy and when? And so we'll end up giving you a very simple, stylized political economy framework to think about what the trade-offs are that rulers face when introducing such a chamber. In particular, we'll try to flesh out one factor that is particularly important, namely the threat represented by the Ottoman Empire at the doors of Vienna. In the second step, we'll look at what we think are the ultimate outcomes. I mean, the ultimate outcomes for us are this territorial consolidation over time. And so we will show you evidence on how introducing these fiscal reforms leads to a higher likelihood of survival of territories, leads to territories becoming larger, and they don't not only become larger at random, they become larger in an organic way. That is, they become more rounded, they have more territorial contiguity, they have fewer enclaves and exclaves. And then in the last step for today, we'll show you what we think could be seen as the mechanism through which this consolidation and higher likelihood of survival is achieved. And these we'll show you that territories that do these fiscal reforms actually obtain greater fiscal revenue, which was, of course, the first and most obvious outcome of these reforms, which also means that they are less likely to resort to short-term lending, which often means lending away cities through pawns. They are more likely to use this revenue that they gain in military infrastructure. They're more likely to defend their cities once they are attacked. So, these military infrastructure investments actually pay off. We can sort of verify that in our data. And we can also show you that these territories are more successful in marrying off their children in a profitable and a successful way. So they will have better marriage outcomes for their children. So, let me just, put this up as a very impressionistic way of, where we want to relate. We, of course, want to relate to a very broad literature in economic history, dating all the way back to the 19th century on the rise of modern bureaucracy, of the modern state, of the territorial state system. Let me just emphasize, since this is a history audience, so you will probably know all of these papers, or you would be very well acquainted. Let me emphasize a different literature, which is the one pointed out here at the bottom. There's a recent literature by, you could call them more development economists or political economists, experimental political economists, like Jonathan Weigel, like Augustin Bergeron, like Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, investigating these fundamental trade-offs that lead to the origin of modern states, imposing the monopoly of violence, but also to imposing modern taxation system and what that involves. And they studied in the context of modern day Congo, for example. A lot of this research takes place in Congo. And so I find this fascinating because this builds a direct bridge between our topics that affect us, that interest us in economic history, and modern day contemporary questions that we have in development economics, how to set up taxation systems in countries with very low state capacity like the modern Congo, and how we can study those kind of economic history questions, deep historical and political history questions that we've faced for the last century, how we can study them in real time for experiments in the Congo today. So here's the outline. I'll talk a little bit about the historical background, and by doing so, we'll try to give you a sense of the political economy, of the trade-offs that territories face when introducing these fiscal institutions. I will give you some more impressions about the data that we're going to use, and then we'll proceed in the 3 steps that I indicated before. We will look at the first stage, the determinants of fiscal centralization. We will look at the ultimate outcomes, and we will look at the channels. Okay, so let me break. So what's the historical context? The historical context is the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, what you see here, your trained eyes will have recognized immediately is not the Holy Roman Empire. This is Germany in the borders of 1937, because our encyclopedic data source that we use for our data is based on those borders. But as you know, the Holy Roman Empire, as Voltaire famously quipped, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It's a very complex array of different territories. Some are secular, some are ecclesiastical. They have very different titles. Some are princes, some are dukedoms, some are margraviates, and so on. And they have also sometimes also different layers of sovereignty. There will be different layers of rulers before the emperor. So what we try to map is actually the highest layer of sovereignty just below the emperor. There's the emperor, which who, as you know, is an elected ruler over the empire, but just below them there are these units that you could think of as the Margraviate of Brandenburg or the Duchy of Bavaria, that over time become more and more powerful and assume more and more these roles of these attributes of sovereignty that today we will attribute to sovereign states. And so in this context, in the Middle Ages, states have a very low fiscal capacity. So rulers typically have some well-defined sources of revenue where they can get their money from. That could be, for example, the main income. The prince owns some forests and he can raise some money from these forests. Or he has the rights to levy some tolls over some bridges, for example, if you're a territory in the Rhine, for example. These sources of revenues are local, and the money also stays locally. Typically, the money does not travel to a centralized court, also because at that point in time, most territories don't have like a centralized court or a capital in the modern sense. So the money accrues locally. There are Ämter, there are local offices that maybe collect the money in that district, in that city. But the ruler, to use his money, has to travel from city to city, from Amt to Amt, and collect the money. And typically, the money is not only collected there, but it's also spent there. It's also spent on purposes locally, and it's spent by the ruler when he moves his court to that city. He's going to tap on that source of revenue in that year. But it also means that in the years in which the ruler does not walk or ride through that city, the money is probably often embezzled or disappears in some way. So we have a big problem of oversight in that world. What happens in the 15th and 16th century, however, is that we have rising revenue needs. One is fairly fuzzy and not well dated concept of the military revolution. So we know that over the course of this period, not sharply, but increasingly, the cost of going to war goes up dramatically because of some technological and organizational changes that happened at that period in time. But in particular for the Holy Roman Empire, what matters is that all of a sudden there's this Ottoman threat outside the doors of Vienna, and so Christianity feels like they're threatened, and so they need to defend Vienna and the empire from this major threat. The problem is that expanding your fiscal base is difficult. If you are the prince of a certain sovereign territory, you can tap on the sources that I mentioned before, because these are your feudal rights. You have certain feudal rights to certain forests, to certain tolls, maybe to the revenues of certain silver mines, but you cannot expand the tax base beyond that. If you want to levy new taxes, in basically all of the territories of the empire, you already have estates by the end of the 14th and for sure by the mid of the 15th century, and you have to go to these states to get your request for new taxes approved. The estates, of course, will ask for control over these taxes. So these are not taxes that you as a prince will control directly. They will be controlled by the states, and the states typically will want those taxes to be earmarked for a special purpose. one thing that you can do as a ruler, as a prince, without asking the states, is pawn away something that you own. So typically you pawn away a city. The problem is that if you pawn away a city, you also pawn away the revenues that come from that city. And so you enter a spiral in which your revenues go down instead of going up. And so typically pawning away a city is the beginning of a downward spiral in which at the end, you're not able to redeem your city that you pawn away and you lose it indefinitely. But at the same time, as a ruler, you are in this constraint. You are in a feudal system, you own allegiance to the emperor. And if the emperor asks you for troops or money for troops to go and fight the infidels at the doors of Vienna, you have to deliver these troops, or at least you have to deliver the money to fund these troops. So what do you do in this context? So one of the solutions that was found and that was increasingly adopted in that period in time is to say, well, we can't really expand the tax base that much. Let's try to be more efficient in raising the taxes that we already have. And so those taxes that, as I said before, could come from domanial forests, from tolls, and so on. You could try to raise that money more efficiently if instead of relying on these decentralized EMTA, these decentralized offices in the single parts of your territory, if instead you set up a centralized bureaucracy run maybe by a professional staff in your capital, and you make sure that every year, not every X years, that every year the money flows from those cities that you own to this central office. Physically, often there is, a little coffer, a box in which the money flows in. There are people in charge. There's actually a wonderful manual, think of it as Machiavelli for the German Empire, that explains to princes how to rule their territories. This manual says you have to set up such an office. You have to pay the staff well. Ideally, take one of them at least should be university trained. Make sure that they're well paid. And so set up a good, honest, well-trained fiscal bureaucracy to make sure that those revenues are raised every year in a reliable way, that you don't have embezzlement, that the money doesn't disappear, and that you have a reliable source of income, that you audit those local offices and so on. Often that also involved a bit of a separation of the private finances of the prince and the finances of the state that, up to that point was a bit of a hazy definition. So these are essentially the trade-offs. You get more efficiency at the cost of setting up a fiscal bureaucracy, which could be a high fixed cost to begin with, could be also high variable cost if you want to pay the staff, and also has a certain psychological and personal cost to the ruler, because of course he loses a little bit this kind of discretionality that he had before, as long as the sources of income weren't that clear and that was sorted out. So this is the setting in which we are. What happens that additionally makes the adoption of these institutions even more worth the while is the fact that we need more and more money to fund the troops against the Ottomans in Vienna. So what happens is that the emperor keeps asking the princes of the empire for more and more money or more and more troops to go and fight his wars, typically against the Ottomans, but also other wars. And it's very hard to raise his money more and more because, as I said before, also technology makes his wars more and more expensive. One thing that happens after various attempts that actually all are not really that successful, but the only attempt that is successful is the setup of this imperial register. So what happens in 1521 is that finally, after over 30 years of discussions, the territories of the empire in the Diet decide on a rule by which how to share the burden of the costs of running the imperial army. And so you can think of this as like the fractions that are agreed on in the European Council on how to finance the EU budget. Okay, so it's years and years of negotiations in which at the end they agree that Bavaria pays 4.21%, Brandenburg pays 3.57%, and so on. So ideally, they set up this kind of rule, and so what happens now is that finally we have an agreement that if the emperor asks for money, these requests of the emperor have to be approved by the imperial diet. But if the emperor asks for money for his troops and these amounts of money are approved by the imperial diet, they're divided amongst the territories of the empire according to the shares set in the imperial register. But importantly, they establish another thing. They establish that the princes can raise this money directly by levying taxes on their subjects without asking the states. And so it's a good reason now to set up an efficient fiscal bureaucracy, because not only you will be able to use this fiscal bureaucracy to raise the money from your domanial forests, from your tolls and so on, but you can also use it to raise these taxes in the name of the emperor, we have a lot of evidence actually that, of course, they raised more money than actually the emperor was requesting and kept a part of it for themselves. But this was actually a major shift that made it even more efficient and even more sensible to set up this, fixed cost, if you want, of setting up a fiscal bureaucracy. So we see these campaigns against the Ottoman Empire as an important turning point in German history. First of all, because they increase the returns to setting up this professional tax administration. You can share the cost of setting up this fiscal bureaucracy among more purposes, but also because it's a turning point in the sense that that's a moment in time when Germany becomes a fiscal, absolutist, bureaucratic state that does not involve the states anymore in decisions regarding taxes. So this key turning point that, as we know, from the classic literature, from Douglas North and so on, is so important, and that, determines why France and Spain developed differently from the Netherlands and England. In Germany happens through these taxes in the 1520s. So let me show you a little bit of the data that we're going to use, and then we'll move to the results. So the data, as I said before, are constructed from this encyclopedia of German cities that covers all of Germany in 1937. And this encyclopedia is information on all the cities accent in those borders in 1937, and has a complete picture of these cities, like which territory they belong to, what they built, whether the city was attacked or not, whether it has market rights or not. And what we did is that we collected all of this information and we aggregated it at the territory level. By doing this, by looking for every year in every city which territory belonged to, we can essentially construct a map of the empire in every year. So this would be a map that is, in a certain sense, would only describe the cities, not the countryside, but we have over 2,300 cities, and we'll be able to draw maps of the Holy Roman Empire for every year, at a much higher level of precision than any other map that you've seen before for the Holy Roman Empire. And so what we'll be able to do is, we take these 2,390 cities that you see here, we draw polygons around them, and then, in principle, we go around and color these polygons year by year. And so I can show you the map for 1400. I can, flip on and show you a map year by year. Here will be 1500, 1600, 1700. And as you can see, there's already this territorial consolidation, right? So all of these territories that, this gray shade maybe is not too clear, that were different territories to begin with, start, coagulating into bigger units like Prussia here, like Bavaria down here. And then in the end, we also have, a big chunk here being Saxony, Hesse down here, and, other territories like Württemberg down here. So this is the data that we're going to use. Other data that will map at that, keep staying at the city level would be data about construction activity. This would be, for example, a measure of economic outcomes year by year in every city. We have measures of military attacks. As you see, they peak in 1618, the first year of the 30 Years' War. And then we have another peak of attacks during the 7 Years' War. The black line is actually the 10-year moving average, is moved average. The gray line is the year-to-year data. And this is actually the last, raw data graph that I want to show you. These are the 39 territories of the empire that for which we find evidence that they introduced a modern fiscal administration through such a chamber, through a Kammer. As you can see, these territories are just 39 out of, over several hundred territories that exist in the empire over that period in time. But those 39 territories, of course, the bigger ones. So by the end of the period considered, about 1,700 cities out of 2,390 are in one of those territories with a modern fiscal administration. As you can also see, there's no real pattern between ecclesiastical and secular. I could draw the same picture in terms of Catholic Protestant. So introducing a modern fiscal bureaucracy is not a prerogative of Protestant states. It's not a prerogative of secular states. A lot of territories in Germany adopted. So let me now go through the first set of results. The first set of results will look at who centralizes, who adopts a modern fiscal institution. And so, you can run, a big regression with a lot of, factors like size, geographic conditions, the usual ruggedness and so on, economic conditions like, the number of cities with city rights, a number of markets and so on, military threats like, have you been attacked by your neighbors in the last 10 years and so on. So what we do is we'll show you a very simple regression in which we want to focus on one thing. We will do a panel data set regression. So we will look at each territory in the empire decade by decade, and we'll try to do a hazard style regression. So we will try to predict whether that territory adopts a modern fiscal administration in a certain decade. And so what we will focus on, however, is one factor in particular. I can show you all the coefficients on all the factors that I described before, but the one factor that we're most interested in, that sort of was fleshed out by our political economy sketch before, is this idea that imperial taxes matter a lot. Whether the emperor comes to you and asks you for a lot of money in a certain decade will actually change your returns from investing in this modern fiscal administration. And remember that the sharing of the burden of paying for the imperial army was shared according to a formula. This formula determined, first of all, the share. So the Reichsmatrikel in 1521 said which share of the overall sum was assigned to your territory. As I said before, for example, 3.57% for Bavaria. But also, this money was not requested every year. So the emperor would not go every year to the Diet wouldn't even meet every year and ask for money. So there is an irregular frequency. So in some years, the Diet would approve requests by the emperor, in many other years, it wouldn't be a request. And then there would be a variation in magnitude. So in certain years, the emperor asks for a lot of money because he needs to run a big campaign against the Turks. In other years, he will ask for less money. And so the interaction of these three factors will actually determine how much tax burden you have to shoulder as a territory on behalf of the emperor in a given year. Now, the niceness of a panel data set is that the first two things can be taken care of by fixed effects, right? You can hold the territory fixed, and that will capture its share, this 3.57%, the prestige that is associated by it and so on will be held fixed by your Bavaria fixed effect, your Brandenburg fixed effect, and so on. The frequency might be taken care of by year and decade fixed effects, but the interaction of the two will not be, will be on top of what is hold fixed by the panel data set. So you can think of it a little bit as a shift share instrument. We have a share that is assigned that is predetermined, not exogenous, but predetermined. And then we have exogenous shifters that are these needs for money that the emperor actually has in irregular intervals. So what we see in our panel data set, and again, I could show you all of the coefficients, but it would end up being a very big and messy table. So what I show you here is that in columns 1 through 4, we add these factors, one block at a time, the geographic factors, internal factors, commercial factors, external pressure. Some of them are significant, some are not significant. But what we find in column 5 is that this shift share factor, as I just described it, this idea that in certain decades, you are facing a bigger part of the overall burden of what the empire has to spend on troops. This is actually a major determinant of whether you adopt a modern fiscal administration in that decade or not. And this is also true in column 6 once we control for everything. So again, let me repeat what we found here. The idea is that in decades in which the emperor is asking for a lot of money, and you as a territory are sharing a big part of the money, are shouldering a big part of the money, in those decades, you're more likely to adopt a modern fiscal administration. So let me now move to the outcomes. And there's a nice quote to begin with, which is a quote by Frederick the Great, who says, the first concern of a ruler has to be to survive, only then comes a question of enlargement. And that's a bit of the spirit that we use to sort out our outcomes. We'll first look at survival rates, and then we will look at what do you do once you survive. Do you become bigger? And if so, how do you become bigger? So we'll look at 3 outcomes. First, the likelihood of survival of territories. Second, the size of territories, how big they are in terms of the number of cities that they control. And third, we will actually introduce a measure of compactness or territorial contiguity. What's the shape of certain territories? What we'll show you is we'll show you evidence both from panel dataset regressions, again, holding territory and year fixed effects constant, and by event study graphs that show you a little bit more what the dynamics of these variables are over time. Okay, so let me first show you the results on territorial survival. And let's focus on the central 2 columns. What we do see here is that the year-to-year likelihood of disappearing of a certain territory is 0.13%. So the dependent variable is multiplied by 100. So you should interpret this as percentage points outcomes. So in every given year, a territory has a 0.13% chance of disappearing. This likelihood is completely eliminated for territories that are adopting a modern fiscal institution that we call treated, so that have adopted a modern chamber, a comma. So as you can see, this is an immediate effect. So if we do an interaction with time since the introduction of the treatment, we don't see much going on. And importantly, it also appears in the kind of outcome that we really care about. So if a territory disappears because of extinction, this is not really affected by your financial possibilities. The fact of whether or not you have male heirs or not is most independent of how much money you can raise, whereas the likelihood of disappearing because you lose in a military conflict is more plausibly linked to having more money raised from taxes. And as you can see, in one case, we do see an effect, in the other one, we do not. You can also see this in an event study graph. This is a bit of a bizarre event study graph in the sense that it only looks at the post period, not at the pre-period. Why? Because by definition, you must have survived up to T0, essentially, if you want to be in our panel data set, right? And so we don't estimate an effect before, but we estimate an effect decade by decade after introduction of the treatment. And as already evident from the regressions, the effect kicks in immediately, the reduction in survival, in disappearance rate, so the increase in survival rates kicks in immediately, is kind of constant over time. When we look at size of territories, on the other hand, we see that this is an effect that takes hold slowly over time. So, this is kind of consistent with the idea that, once you have more money raised for taxation, it takes some while to invest the money, go and wage a military campaign and so on. And so we do see in the diff and diff, we should see a direct effect of being treated, of adopting a modern fiscal administration, on becoming bigger, on the number of size and the number of cities that are ruled by yourself. But if you look at the interaction term of time since treatment, you see that the effect is actually one that kicks in slowly over time. This is much more visible, of course, if I show you the event study graph, which shows you very clearly that over time, territories become bigger after they introduce this fiscal reform. So, just to give you a sense of the magnitude, this is the log number of cities that the territory is controlling. So 10 or more decades after the treatment, a territory that is controlled, that is treated, that it has adopted the modern fiscal administration, is about 25 to 30% larger than a comparable territory that has not adopted this reform. We'll also look at compactness, at roundedness. So what we compute is a measure of roundedness that is kind of inspired but not identical to the one that is used in the gerrymandering literature. So just to capture this idea that territories become more round. They're not composed of many scattered parts, but they actually try to achieve a better shape, also to better exert fiscal capacity and to better exert your monopoly of violence, for example. And as we can see here, again, there is no pre-trend, but there's a slow takeoff over time that makes territories much more rounded over the period considered. So, before I show you the mechanism, let me do a small detour and, put a little footnote to what I just said. I've tried to be careful in saying that that's not the causal effect. And if I imply that, I apologize. Of course, there's a lot of reasons to be careful here in claiming these effects are causal. There's a lot of things going on. As you've seen before, these are clearly the bigger and larger and better organized territories. These might be the territories that have far-sighted leaders, like Frederick II. Or maybe these are reforms that are done in a bundle. Maybe the fiscal administration reforms comes with other reforms that happen at the same time. And then there are some econometric concerns that you might have also experienced in the last few years. There's been booming literature in estimating effects in event study settings with heterogeneous treatments. We have some answers to this. We want to be careful and cautious here and not oversell, and tell you that we are cautiously confident that these are effects that are probably to be assigned in a causal sense to the fiscal reforms, but of course, we will not have a very strong claim on that. So the good thing that makes us happier and a bit more confident about our results is that, first of all, we're very proud that this is the first study that studies the universe of territories in that period in time. And a lot of studies that talk about fiscal capacity and so on actually look at the subset of ex-post selected territories. They will look at Prussia, they will look at the successful examples of reform, but they cannot start, as opposed to our data set, from the universe of territories extant, for example, in 1400 or 1500. We also are confident that this is not driven by outliers. We can control for a wide range of other factors. We also have in this as a default territory and time fixed effects. Moreover, we're kind of certain that these reforms did not happen in a bundle. The last thing that we can do, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you in detail today because I have only 6 minutes left, is the idea that maybe still you have reasons of concerns that could be allayed by us pulling a magic IV out of a hat. The good thing that we can already say even before showing you our IV is that we do not find strong evidence of pure pretrends, actually almost no pretrends for none of the variables that we considered. And so this also makes us more confident in this idea that there's nothing going on before in these territories. There's no other confounding factor happening at the same time. What we do is we also show some results of a two-stage least squares setting where we actually instrument the adoption of this reform, of this fiscal reform, by the measure of burden that you're shouldering of the overall imperial tax burden. So we will use the imperial tax contribution either as a continuous variable or in a nonlinear first stage as a predictor of whether you adopt this fiscal reform or not, just as in the first stage regression that I showed you in the previous section. And we will then use those predicted values or predicted dates of adoption in our second stage, and we will get very similar results. Let me now, in the last part of my presentation, show you what we think are the mechanisms through which this consolidation happens. And we'll show you four channels. I'll jump straight into the outcomes. The first one is the increase in revenue per se. If you want to think about it in a way, this is the most immediate first stage that you want to show. Do these states really raise more revenues once they do these reforms? And at first, this was like my goal. When I entered this project, I said, this is the first thing that we need to find out. Turns out that, if you think about it for a second, this is like, Schrodinger's principle a little bit, Schrodinger's uncertainty principle, is that, by definition, these territories, before they did these reforms, they typically didn't have good statistics about the taxes they collected. That is, the essence of the reform is getting a better handle of your finances. And so by definition, those territories don't have a pre-post comparison of how much money they were raising. We only found 2 dissertations, thank God they're careful scholars. There used to be careful German scholars in the 60s and 70s who wrote ponderous dissertations and really went to archives. And so we found 2 dissertations on Hesse and Saxony that actually have data for pre and post. And what you can see, the vertical line is the date of adoption of a modern fiscal administration of a Kammer in those 2 territories. And as you can see in both territories, you have a distinct increase in the amount of revenues before, after the introduction of this reform. What we also see is that those territories are less likely to resort to this inefficient way of raising money. As I said before, if a ruler really needed money quickly now, today, the best way to get it before these fiscal reforms was to pawn away something that he owned, typically a city. And so what we do see is that the likelihood of pawning away a city goes down by about 10% in the decade after the treatment. So you're less likely to do stupid things like pawning away a city if you have a more steady stream of revenue guaranteed by a good fiscal administration. What we also see, if we use our data on military construction, is that these territories are investing more in military buildings. It's a bit noisy because military buildings, you don't build them every year, a new fortification, a new wall, and so on. But as you can see, there's clearly a positive effect on the number of military buildings that these territories are constructing. What we also see is that these military buildings are useful. So what we do is we can look at these territories and see if they're more likely to defend themselves successfully once they're attacked after they have introduced these reforms. And what we can see, for example, if you focus on column 2, is that we see that the city is more likely to change hands, to have a different owner in year T+1 relative to year T if a city is attacked, which is kind of obvious. If you're attacked, you have a 70% chance of belonging to someone else the following year. But if you're attacked and you are treated, so if you have a modern fiscal administration, this likelihood goes down to almost 0. So you almost guarantee, it's almost safe insurance for your cities that they are going to be defended successfully in the case of attack. Finally, we look at marriage success. So we define marriage success as the number of rulers that you're connected with within 3 nodes in your network before and after the marriage of your daughters. And so this is basically the gain in connectedness that you get as a dynasty through the marriages of your daughters. And as you can see, again, we see no pretrends, but after introducing this treatment, rulers are much more likely to marry off their daughters well in a way that is much better connected. Why does fiscal administration matter for marrying off your daughters? Because you had to pay dowries, and that was very expensive. You had to throw a big party if you wanted your daughter to marry well, not to marry some secondary nobility, but the daughter of the Margrave of Brandenburg. You had to pay a big dowry, and that is only possible if you have steady streams of revenue. So let me conclude, and I think I'm almost on time. So what we did is we studied the consolidation of this European map, and we tried to relate it to this major fiscal reform. This major fiscal reform that we identified occurred in 39 territories of the empire in the period in time considered. We showed you what happened with these territories. They survived and they became bigger, as Frederick II wanted. And we also showed you how they did it. Let me just conclude with one more far-reaching note on why we care about this. One reason why we care about this is that we personally think that fiscal capacity is very important. We've had a lot of focus on sovereign debt, but sovereign debt is not in economic history, but sovereign debt is not a tool that is typically available to these territories in the period in time. They are actually much more reliant on taxes, and that's why understanding how they became efficient in raising taxes is very important. It's also important because we want to understand the political economy of these territories. And so, as I said before, Douglas North and his friends have given us very good narratives as to what happened in France and Spain as opposed to the Netherlands and Britain, why there was this kind of bifurcation, as some recent authors have called it, between parliamentarism and absolutism. But we had very little evidence on when and why it happened in Germany. I think our research can also shed light on the key turning point in 1521, when these imperial taxes were introduced, and it actually meant that Germany went down the way to absolutist, bureaucratic, but also highly efficient bureaucratic state. So I'll stop here. Thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for this. The way this works is you should type questions into the question feature, and as a few come in, if a bunch of people have what seems to me a similar question, I'll pose it myself. If in fact you have a question which you're alone, I'll just unmute you and you can ask the question yourself. But go ahead and write your questions in this question box. I have a couple things myself. I'll just start off and I'll give you the chance to write your questions. This is probably just my own limitations, but I never understood what the units are. So when you aggregate the cities up to Bavaria, is it just the cities, or you have some measures of what the countryside is like?
No, our unit of observation is the city. And so when we, for example, count the size of a territory, the size of a territory is measured through the size of cities. When we measure, whether a territory is attacked or not, it's whether a city is attacked or not, because essentially that's the source of our information. So, if you want, this is one limitation, that we identify a territory through the set of all cities that belong to the territory. We have no information on the countryside surrounding the cities.
That's just a clarification.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I'm starting to get some questions. I'll get to the queue in a minute. The other thing I thought was, I was a little bit confused about the role of the ruler's own assets, what you call the demesne. My understanding was that for many cases that was really, really important, and you emphasizing the taxation and so forth, and I understand why. But could you talk more about heterogeneity in that and how that might affect your results?
Yeah. So territories had very high variance in how much demand income they could rely on. Typically the biggest outliers in that sense are the territories with mines, with silver mines. Think of Saxony, think of Tyrol, and so on. So these are areas where the ruler, had basically a resource curse. Most of its income came from these sources. There is variation. There's also some other territories like Katzenelnbogen on the Rhine that has, 80% of its revenues come just from one bridge on the Rhine. So there's variation in that. I subsumed it all under taxation, and I understand that that was an imprecision on my side. The idea is that all of these sources of revenues have to be administered in some way, even domanial incomes like owning land and forest and so on. And you have to have a kind of centralized office, ideally, that makes sure that this money comes in, that audits all of the sources of revenues. And so that's why I subsume it under taxation and under all of those things that become more efficient in being raised once you have this institution set in place.
Okay. And then a final question. We're starting to get some people in the queue, so I'll turn to the queue. But final question is, you treat the introduction of this comma as a binary event, and I understand why, right? But like I've read a lot of the literature on Prussia, and there's a lot of argument about whether what they first did made any sense, and over time it improved and so forth. So, I understand why you're doing this? Isn't like saying you should do it differently, but could you speculate for us on how much false starts, improvements in the administration of the comma, and so forth would actually affect what you're showing us here?
Yeah. So I totally agree with you. Ideally, we want to know, was it a permanent institution or not? Was it the false start or not? How much staff did they have? Did it start off big and then reduce it and became bigger over time or not? The one thing that we certainly try to make sure of is that there was no reversal. So we never found a case of reversals. And actually, we found positive reinforcements in the sense that we saw, for example, historical evidence, someone saying, well, this territory, Hessen-Kassel, ceased to exist, but it's taken over by Hessen-Marburg, and Hessen-Marburg actually continues to keep this institution because they found it so efficient. So we do actually make sure that whenever there's a transition between dynasties, for example, that the institution keeps existing. But I agree with you that ideally we want to know more about that. How should I speculate in terms of how much heterogeneity there is? I'm sure that the smaller territories probably had more false starts and probably had more difficulties in setting it up than big territory like Brandenburg, as you said. But I have no real evidence on that. It was very hard to find evidence in the first place about its existence at all, let alone about its constitution, how many people work in there, how efficient they are, and so on.
Okay, we're getting a couple of questions from the queue, and since they're well written, I'm just going to read them. I think that might be simplest. So Shevket Pomek asks, how unique was the territorial and political arrangements in Germany? I'm wondering to what extent your insights might apply to other countries in early modern Europe, such as France, Netherlands, Britain, and also Spain and Russia.
Well, this is a great question. So, it's the usual, trade-off between a great setting where you can do certain analysis and its external validity. So the great setting about Germany is that you can do a large N study, the kind of analysis that you would have done on, thinking about the trade-offs between taxation and representation, or the trade-offs between, how to enlarge a tax base in Spain or in France. You could mostly do through country by country comparisons, or you would have to go through the single case and use a different approach, like more analytic narratives approach. For example, the advantage of the German case is, of course, that you can do almost large N study and run panel data set, as in our case, with territory and time fixed effects. So to that extent, of course, Germany is special. It's special in a great sense that you can observe many little experiments of introducing this reform or not in otherwise similar territories. On the other hand, I would say that this kind of dynamics are certainly timeless, in the sense that these trade-offs that you would face between how do I deal with estates? How do I deal with the fact that if I raise money for estates, I will control them? I need to find maybe a way to bypass them. These are questions that all rulers had at this, in that period in time, as we know. And, to the extent that, we think that sort of the economy and society in these countries were similar, I think that the positive effects of having, predictable, well-planned, well-bureaucratically organized stream of revenues that could be arguably similar, whether it's in, modern day Belgium, in France or Spain, or in Germany. So, the idea that, with this money, you can do things like investing in military infrastructure, like marrying off your offspring better, or like, not doing things like pawning away cities, but, putting your state on a very, solid long-term financial base. I think that could be plausibly true for all countries in that period in time.
The American in me thinks that what you've done is read too much Alexander Hamilton, but we can come back to that. So another question, I'm just going to read this by Denis Cognat. I hope I pronounced that correctly. On the side of expenditure, can you measure to which extent the private account of the ruler was separate from the public account of the territory? In the case of marriage, it seems the two accounts were not separate.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, to some extent, this is a, those of us who live or have lived in a constitutional monarchy know that it's a problem up to today, right? So, how do you separate those two finances? Where do you draw the line? What kind of check do you write every year to Queen Elizabeth, and so on? to some extent, my understanding is that in that period in time is the first time where, they start thinking, there starts being a discussion in the manuals, and, the state lawyers in the time, the jurists start thinking about this concept of separating the two things. There is also this wonderful quote in this handbook of German princes that I mentioned before. As I said, I called it the German Machiavelli. He not only says that you should hire well-trained lawyers to run this, but he also says you should forgive your prince if, to relieve himself from the cumbersome work of state administration, he sometimes embezzle some of the money for himself. So there is an understanding that there is a separation, that this separation is a little bit fuzzy. But my understanding is also that marrying of daughters and dowry is clearly an affair of the state. So what the prince takes as his private money and sometimes embezzles to, quote unquote, as his manual says, refresh himself from the cumbersome burden of governing, is money to run parties, celebrate, own feasts, go hunting and that kind of stuff. Marrying of a daughter is certainly a state affair, and certainly something that, also, the states would vote on, for example. So that definitely is part of the public finances. I don't have data about it. However, I don't see in the states, private separate accounts for, this is the private finances or not.
Okay, then Chi Zhao asks, how did you treat free imperial cities in your territory level regressions? i.e., how did you calculate their size, pawning, compactness, marriage outcomes, etc.?
Good question. The free imperial cities actually drop off in these regressions because they are not, they're not under the same dynamics. They don't introduce a chamber. They don't have this problem of organizing their finances. They're in a completely different organizational world. They only have to tax their citizens. They've done it all throughout. They don't have this structure of estates. They don't have demanial sources of income. So this is a very different dynamic. And so admittedly, they drop off. And so, in a way, that's also, another selling point, at the same time, a limitation and a selling point of our study. Most of the studies that we know, for example, Sasha Becker and co-authors have a study on fiscal capacity in a slightly earlier period, in the medieval period in Germany, but they only focus on cities. Why? Because cities, it's relatively easy to find evidence on taxation in cities, but the political economy is a completely different one. Whereas in the period that we considered, free imperial cities, in the end, are sort of the losing model. They're the model that is not successful in the long run. They're past their peak in that period in time. And so that's why we think it's also very important to focus our attention on the emergence of territorial states.
Okay, I should say that the queue is now empty. I have a long list of questions of my own, and I'll just drone on and on, but I'll stop the minute somebody else posts a question. So again, David, asking you to speculate, because I know that you can't really do this. You rely on Kaiser for your cities, which means you only have the Reich as of 1937. Yeah. Could you speculate? There's big chunks of the Holy Roman Empire that are not in the Reich. I mean, maybe to the, frustrating, and some people's wishes were frustrated, but if you looked at the other lands that are left out of your study, but in the Holy Roman Empire, do you have any sense of how they would look different in this period? Yeah, I mean, the other lands that are in the Holy Roman Empire, but not in our borders, I would guess that 80% at least of them are under Habsburg rule. And so it's one territory, and it's one territory that actually, in principle, is the first one to adopt this system. So this system in our data, the first territory to adopt this system of a centralized Kammer is Württemberg, and Württemberg does it in 1521 under Austrian occupation. So it's imposing a model that the Austrians, the Habsburgs, are actually imposing on Württemberg, while the Duke of Württemberg, Christoph, is actually held captive, and the Austrians are reorganizing the state on his behalf. So the model, the whole idea of running state finances through a chamber, through a professionally staffed chamber, comes from the Habsburgs. And the Habsburg have run this basically since the beginning of the 16th century. Sorry, I'm Italian. I always get confused with the numbers of centuries because we use a different numbering. So in the beginning of the 16th century, so 1500 teens, the Austrians introduced this system. And so to the extent, again, that our external validity exists, that our study is informative, I hope it's also informative for Austria. And that will cover 80% or 90% of what we're not covering with Germany in the borders of 37. So, all of Bohemia, all of, modern day Belgium, and, part of Silesia that is not in our data. And then finally, I'm sorry, I missed one. Tony Moore asked, does it matter whether a ruler of a particular state was also the emperor? I think you may have already answered that question, but do you have more to say? Yeah, so in the period that we consider, all of the emperors are Habsburgs. So they're all, in a way, also outside of our system, which is, kind of
nice in a way that they're not endogenous to our system. They are outside, but probably, as I just speculated, Austria or the Habsburg lands had a similar development.
So I have a question, which is maybe a little bit too nerdy, but I'm going to pose it. I was struck by, as you said, there's these wonderful tradition of nerdy German graduate students actually going to archives many years ago. And unfortunately, that appears to be dying out. You rely, I'm not saying excessively, but you rely on Klein, which is published in 1974. Has there been is there much more literature since Klein? And I know Tilly's work on this sort of general question of public finance in early modern and modern Germany. In other words, are you sort of coming back to something that really died out, or is there a literature that people could sort of pursue if they wanted to?
Sorry, there was a hiccup. I don't know if it was my internet connection or yours. So could you just repeat the last two sentences? I ended with Klein. Is there a literature that has sort of continued in history, economic history, or are you sort of resurrecting a set of questions in this area that died out? I think we have to separate that's my understanding, the two literatures in terms of doing the nitty-gritty work of finding out and describing the institutional arrangements, which is something that historians of the previous generation have done in a way that no one is doing anymore today. And so this is why, as you rightly point out, the major source of our data is, apart from Kaiser, is Klein. And the case studies of territory by territory that we use to find out, when territories adopted as institutions and how they did, is also mostly based on, again, a historiography that comes from a different tradition. So in terms of measuring and describing institutions, there is a historiography that is unsurpassed, and I don't think there has been an improvement since. At least I couldn't find anything. It's not like that we only looked at literature from the 60s and 70s on purpose. It's just, when you look for a good history of public finances in Hessen or a good history of the public finances in Mecklenburg, that's all you have. Some of these scholars are still alive. I had, several conversations with a retired professor in Greifswald, who is the expert on public finances in Mecklenburg. But, most of them are, members of, definitely a previous generation. In terms of understanding the dynamics in the political economy, of course, there is a more recent literature, and, certainly among economic historians, but as I, tried to hint at in the literature review, also by, political economists, political scientists in the broader sense, this is experimental literature. In a way, I see it in that tradition as well.
So Nathan, I know you have your hand up. I'm going to come to you. There's one more question here from your this is Victor Perez Sanchez. I wonder if at the moment of requesting money, the emperor is forcing rulers to impose the new fiscal model.
No, the emperor is not imposing them. What happens at the time is that, in 1521, you have this agreement on the shares, and then the territories start raising the money, and it's unclear whether they can do so through direct taxation or not. They go to their subject and say, oh, the emperor wants money, I have to tax you. And in several territories, the states are actually upset, and they go to the Reichskammergericht, to the empire's court, and actually say this is an infringement on the rights of these states. And actually, there are several cases that are discussed, and the last case in 1537, and they all unambiguously, for some politically common economy reason or not, they all end up deciding in favor of the rulers and establishing the fact that the rulers do not need to ask these states to raise these taxes. So, this part of the arrangement is certainly something that comes out of a bargaining that is resolved by the Reichskammergericht. The emperor is also not asking them to set up these fiscal institutions. So, we see, simply from the fact also that these institutions, some of them are introduced in the 1520s and 30s, but some of them are introduced in the 17th and 18th century. And so certainly was not part of a bond. It's not like a Washington consensus thing where it's like, you raise the taxes on my behalf, but I ask you to reorganize your taxes. This only happens, as I said before, in Württemberg, where Württemberg is under Austrian occupation, and the Austrian occupiers set up this system. In all other territories, it's adopted voluntarily.
Okay, so Nathan, you can just unmute yourself and speak.
Okay, so thank you, David. I don't want to take up the time because we're ending up on the formal part of the seminar. Just a quick question, maybe I'll follow up later. In some, so fiscal consolidation of the sort you're describing occurred obviously earlier in England and France, kind of on a more central level. Would be kind of as a lesson for history, some policy thinking about the fiscal. Is it in a way this model that the emperor used, and sort of imposing this tax created sort of long-term challenges in consolidating Germany or unifying Germany in some sense in the long run. I mean, that's kind of, so you have these very strong territorial states that are impediment for the greater unification until that happens later on in the 1870s. So is that kind of a unintended consequence of this, if you may, in terms of the policies of the emperor?
Yeah, so sorry, I still have problems with my connection, but I think I understood most of the question. So, my understanding is that, and that is the way I would read it, is that definitely these changes that happened in 1521 with the introduction of the imperial tax and the legal principles that were set up in the wake of it, they actually definitely strengthened the territories, right, on at the detriment of the emperor, because it made sure that these territories were actually the ones in charge of raising the tax. So before, up to 1495, actually the emperor was trying to raise taxes directly from all the subjects of the empire. But the emperor gave up on it because it wasn't feasible. So clearly the fact that you had to go through the rulers, through the princes of Brandenburg and Bavaria and Hessen, was clearly a sign of weakness of the emperor. And the fact that on top of that, you enable these rulers to raise these taxes without asking the states made them even stronger. And so all of this idea that, territorial sovereignty is kind of formed in Germany over the course of the centuries. And, a lot of the, political science literature and history literature focuses also on the 30 Years' War and the Westphalian agreements, but a lot of that happens already before. And I think this is a key moment in history where giving these territories the right to tax and to tax so much, and the emperor retreating from the idea of taxing himself, is actually a key moment in establishing these power relations in the empire.
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's time to bring the formal part of this to a close. I should say that some of you, I've just realized this, and maybe it was my fault, but I was told to monitor the question queue, and some of you were putting things in the chat queue. So I missed you, and I didn't mean to do that. I wasn't ignoring you. So I think now we move to a more informal part of this. If you want to ask a question at this point, please put it in the question in A so I can see one thing. I'm too old to monitor two things. And I'll just unmute you and you can ask your question to Davida directly. I'm actually having a hard time. I'm sorry, I lost one of the screens I need here. Again, if you want to ask a question, please tell me in the Q&A queue, and I will just unmute you if I can figure out how to do that without making a mess of it. Anyway, Davida, for those who are leaving, thank you for this paper. Those of you who didn't read it, I encourage you to read it. It's very carefully written, and I think that you get a lot out of reading it.
Shevket raised his hand.
There's too many things going on. I'm sorry, I'm not monitoring this all. Shevket, do you want to say something? If you do, yeah, there he is. So Shevket, I'm going to try to unmute you.
Okay.
There you go. There you go.
Okay. Here is another question I have, especially in terms of its applicability to other parts of the world. Do you have data on the extent to which some of these tax collections were retained locally and not sent to the emperor? And if you do, is it possible for you to exploit the variation between the different territories in terms of funds retained locally and not sent? Can you get any mileage out of that?
That's a great point. That's something that we definitely thought about, and we thought it was a super interesting dimension to think about. There is a lot of evidence on territories taxing more, as you say, and keeping some of the money for themselves. So saying this is all taxes raised in the name of the emperor, but in fact, 40% goes into their pockets and 60% in the pockets of the emperor. We know because it was a commonplace. People would joke about it in the empire. The subjects would be in the know. There would be also cases, again, going to the Reichskammergericht of estates saying we have a sense that our prince is taxing more than he should. Let's compare the numbers. We don't have systematic evidence on that. So we only have, anecdotal evidence about here and there, 2 or 3 states where, it was well known, where there were, pamphlets about it, where there were, cases brought to the courts. It's hard to take that and make that a systematic data set. I wish.
Thanks.
Okay, are there other, okay, I'm now monitoring both the chat and the hands raised and the Q&A. So we're going to see just how much I can multitask. Does anybody else have any? I have to leave soon, but the session will continue with under Nathan's leadership. Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, I'm looking at the chat. So Thomas Ciesemer has asked something about growth. I don't know if Thomas is still, he's not in the audience.
Yeah, he's not here anymore. I didn't see it. People were putting stuff in the chat and I didn't see that. I wasn't looking at both places.
Yeah, Thomas is asking about growth starting around 1500. I could speculate, it's also a good definition of what is growth in that period, right? So we do have some measures of construction activity, for example. We don't see a general effect on construction activity, for example. We do see that those territories that adopt these institutions invest more in military infrastructure, but we don't see a general effect on all kinds of buildings. We don't even see an effect on religious buildings, for example. So to that extent, it's hard to speculate or actually find evidence on growth being related to that. It seems really something that helped the state becoming stronger, less about making the economy stronger.
Okay, I need to leave, unfortunately, but thank you very much, David. The session will continue. But thanks very much, and thanks
Great
for
to
those
see you,
who
Tim. Thanks for
participated.
moderating.
Nice to
Thank
see
you,
you all.
Tim.
Virtually. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Tim. So I'll take over for the remaining few minutes. So as David, can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear well.
Okay, because beforehand there was some issues, so I don't see any new questions, but I have a question to ask about the dynamics of this. It's kind of I didn't follow exactly the arguments. So so initially you have territories that adopt a chamber and collect their taxes versus those that don't, and the ones that do survive. So all the consolidation that takes place is amongst those that did not adopt. So all the ones that adopted in 1521 basically stay intact, different sizes all the way through. And there's a long process of consolidations of those that didn't adopt the chamber in 1521. Is that correct? And if that's correct, have you tried to do kind of a more long-term survival or hazard things? Or how long do they survive in some sense? Why are some cities that did not adopt these things survive longer than others?
Okay,
or other territories?
So let me just say one thing. So the adoption of the reform is not only 1521. So 1521 is the first territory, and 1521 is a change in the structure of imperial finances that actually changes the incentives. But the adoption occurs in the 2 centuries following it. So we have early adopters, we have late adopters. In terms of the selection, and I agree, that is the core issue. And part of our motivation of entering this is to say, all of what we talk about in terms of evidence on how important modern taxation systems are is based on a selected sample. We do look at taxes in Prussia, but we never study taxes in the Palatinate that disappears, right? And arguably in 1500, the Palatinate is a bigger and more important territory than Brandenburg. We try to get at that by through 2 steps. One is actually looking at conditional on doing these reforms, and conditional on having survived up to that point. That's the effect of these reforms. But the step before is our analysis on the likelihood of survival, and that actually shows you clearly that as you rightly pointed out, is that the reform itself makes you more likely to survive. And so you do have that selection in there. That said, one way to think about it is to say, let's look at the effect. So if it's all driven by the selection into the group of territories that do the reform, And if that's your concern, one way to think about it is to estimate the effect of the reform only within the set of territories that actually do the reform eventually, and estimating basically the effect by comparing, by exploiting the variation, who adopted earlier and who adopted later, right? And so the counterfactual of an early adopter is a late adopter that has not adopted the reform yet. And interestingly, the magnitude of the coefficient is almost exactly the same when you look at the intensive margin. So which sort of suggests, it's not a formal model of selection, but it suggests to you that the selection is not a major issue, because if you find the same effects within that sample, it gives you a sense that probably the selection is not a big issue in terms of heterogeneity of effects.
And so related to that is the extinction, as you call it. So that's kind of a 0-1 thing, or do you also measure how long did it take for extinction to occur? So, and what kind of variance you would have there. So some cities or some territories didn't adopt all these things. They were doing fine for like 3 centuries, and in the end they got hit. But for 3 centuries, they didn't have to bother with all this. And or they're all basically the survival time. It's not just the actual survival, but how long you survive using a different institution.
Yeah, so I didn't get, unfortunately, again, because of connectivity issues, I think the first half of your sentence. In terms of the length of the treatment, that's an interesting question. I mean, definitely having been an early adopter might have led to different effects, and having had this institution in place for 200 years is different than having it for 50 years only. To some extent, we do not see big evidence on heterogeneity of effects. It's our sense is that if you do leave one out regressions, if you look at what is driving your PENA regressions, we do not see evidence that there is a major difference between early adopters, which likely had this treatment for 200 years and could learn under different circumstances than late adopters.
Okay, let's see if we have. I don't see any other. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing to do, I would think. And the other thing is, again, doing the same thing on those that didn't adopt.
Yeah.
How long they survived. And
yeah.
And are there any, what
yeah.
can explain how long they survive without adoption? And that's the other side of it. It's interesting also in terms of trying to get the nuances, because you have such a great data set. I mean, these are additional insights I think we can get from this.
I agree.
Okay, so I see we're pretty much done. So let me thank you again for joining us and sharing this great paper with us. And
well, thank you, Nathan. It's a great opportunity, great crowd. Thanks to everybody who attended. And see you soon.
See you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.